Hello, all. I think that we will go ahead and get started and let folks trickle in, but we want to make sure that we have enough time for the presenters here. Hello there and welcome. My name is Tyler Best, and I am one of the Springboard community managers. Today's webinar, Behavioral Design, a Deeper Dive, is presented by Springboard, an online community under the Breakthrough Action Project. Breakthrough Action is USAID's flagship program on social and behavior change and ignites collective action and encourages people to adopt healthier behaviors by forging, testing, and scaling up new and hybrid approaches to SBC. If this is your first Springboard webinar, then welcome. So what is Springboard? Springboard is an online community of over 4,000 SBC professionals from over 100 countries. Springboard can help you advance your SBC skills, connect with colleagues and SBC leaders, and get inspired through resources, events, and jobs. If you're not a member of Springboard already, join today. Again, welcome, and please feel free to use the chat feature on the bottom to introduce yourself and your organization, as well as add any questions that come up throughout today's event. Today's webinar is going to look and feel a little differently. Rather than having individual presentations, I'm going to hand it over now to our two presenters to lead today's webinar. We're very lucky to have with us today Prithika Mohan, a senior behavioral design specialist at Busara Center for Behavioral Economics, and McElwee, a senior behavioral designer at Ideas 42. Over to you both.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the webinar. Before we get started, we wanted to do a quick icebreaker to gauge where everyone is at, and there's obviously no right or wrong answer. What we want everyone to do at this point is, if you see the QR code above on the screen, if you have your phone, go ahead and use that to scan it. Otherwise, you can go to menti.com and enter the code 89710671, and it's indicated on the screen. And we want you to answer, to the best of your knowledge, what is behavioral design in 1 to 2 words? I'm going to post this on the chat as well, so everyone can see it. But feel free to do that, and then we'll just take a few minutes to gauge where everyone's at right now. So to the best of your knowledge, what is behavioral design in 1 to 2 words? And Ellie will share the Menti screen so you can see what other people are saying as well. Okay, we have a lot of different answers coming in. Great. Great. A lot of really interesting words people are using. Yeah, I think it's a lot of these different components together is what behavioral design is. And that's a lot about what me and Ellie are going to talk about today. But before we go and dive into what behavioral design is, we're going to continue answering sending multiple options. We're just going to give a brief overview of what behavioral economics is, before we dive into what actually behavioral design does. So I'll give Ellie a minute to go back to the other screen. Great. So before we go into talking about behavioral science, we want to give an overview of understanding decision making and what economics actually tells us about it. So if you look at mainstream economics, what does it actually say about individuals? It says that we're 100% rational, we're 100% focused on money as an incentive, and it's homo economics. But actually, this is like a popular misconception. We're not actually 100% this. So what does it actually assume? It assumes that people behave as if they have preferences. That is that we like some things more than others. It also assumes that these preferences can be molded as being rational. So it's complete, it's transitive, it's reflexive. When an outcome is uncertain, people choose among options based on expected utility. So the best probable weighted outcome. And then people may like or dislike and or not care about risk. So that's also what it assumes. And then, but actually a lot of this is not what happens. And this isn't how we typically make decisions. When we think about actually what behavioral science tells us and how we actually approach this, it actually tells us that people don't actually make a lot of rational decisions versus what traditional economics tells us. So in traditional economics, it states that humans make optimal decisions based on maximum utility. That's effectively weighing the costs and benefits. The rational consumer always knows what they want and acts to achieve it. And then behavioral economics states that humans are make somewhat optimal decisions to maximize utility, but they try to weigh costs and benefits, but people don't always know what they will want and don't always act to achieve it when they do know. So that's a little bit about behavioral economics. I'm going to hand it over to Ellie, who's going to dive a little bit deeper into this.
Thank you for that quick introduction. I will just expand just slightly more from behavioral economics and see really where does this come from. Behavioral economics, as Prithika shared with us, is really kind of the melding of two fields. So here we see that behavioral economics comes from mixing both psychology and economics coming together to make behavioral economics. And so this discipline really started many decades ago when psychologists who were looking at how people make the best decisions and economists were looking at how people make the best decisions. And slowly they started to borrow pieces from each other's fields of study. And ultimately, behavioral economics was born. And so kind of repeating as Prithika said, behavioral economics is a field of research that combines data from economics and psychology to better understand how people form intentions, make decisions, and act, or why they might fail to act. So really borrowing from these two fields of study. However, we don't want to stop just at behavioral economics. We want to also look forward. So questions that we get all the time, Ideas 42, I'm sure also at Busara, is what's the difference between behavioral economics, what's behavioral science, and what is behavioral design? And so hopefully we can clear some of that up for you today. So while we will use some of these terms interchangeably, there are subtle differences that we want to just make sure people are aware of right now. So while the field of behavioral economics kind of emerged, frequently cited to Thaler and Kahneman, we want to recognize that this just has psychology and economics. But people were really realizing when working behavioral economics that there are insights that could improve this from other social sciences, as they all have a lot to say about human behavior. So this is where behavioral science emerged. It was a cross-pollination of many fields that borrowed insights and hypotheses from these different traditions. So behavioral science is really kind of a larger discipline whose practitioners are united by a common interest of understanding how humans work, how our brains tick, as well as a commitment to scientifically testing designs, rigorous hypothesis-driven methods. So Ideas 42, we use the term behavioral science more often than behavioral economics because we feel it's more accurate and inclusive label for our highly interdisciplinary work, though in some cases it can be helpful to use the term economics as it helps us share a common language with colleagues who work in different contexts. So that just to show, oops, sorry, my animation is not working. So just to show you really, behavioral science is borrowing from all these fields: psychology, cognitive science, political science, economics, sociology, anthropology, neuroscience, and kind of even more. So now we have behavioral economics, behavioral science. So what is behavioral design? What everyone came here to talk about today. So in talking about behavioral design, we want to bring up human-centered design. And so human-centered design is an approach to innovation that starts by listening to people and ends with solutions tailored to their needs. So that is to say that kind of any design you really want centered around humans. You want the people, if you're working with people and behavior change, you want to center the humans that you're working with. And so in this, we use behavioral science, which is a way of, we talk about behavioral design, and this really refers to the application of behavioral science insights and frameworks to develop ways to improve how humans interact with the world around them. And typically, this is through behaviorally informed changes, and we do these changes to products, processes, and policies. So in a way, behavioral design is to behavioral science what field like engineering is to physics. Behavioral design is the application of research findings from laboratories in behavioral science to the field of studies and real-world problem solving. And so to do this, behavioral design borrows elements from other frameworks and problem-solving approaches to guide the application of behavioral science insights. First, we use system thinking. I think that my animations got a little messed up there. Sorry, guys. So basically here, behavioral science is supposed to move here, but my animation didn't move. But also with behavioral science, we look at systems thinking. And thinking about the kind of a complex context within most human behavior occurs. There are competing drivers and blockers of behaviors. There's feedback channels, and there's the potentials for unintended consequences. So we really tap into systems thinking to make sure we're allowing for empathy and really incorporating the complexity that humans interact with to our behavioral science insights. And finally, human-centered design, which you can see here on the right. It's an approach that places the end user, or the people we ultimately hope to serve, at the center of all design thinking. And really this starts with privileging empathy with them and feedback from them throughout the entire design process. And really with all of these, it's a way to make sure that whatever we wind up creating, the end user and not us as the behavioral designers are really remaining the higher authority. And now I will pass back to Prithika to talk about our system one.
Thank you, Ellie. So an important thing for us to keep in mind as we go into thinking about intervention designs, as we think about creating any products or services or policies for people, it's to keep in mind this dual system theory, which we're just going to walk through and like give people an overview of. So what does it actually mean? So if you look at this problem, which is 2 into 2, I want to just give people a minute here. And then if you look at the next problem, which is 22 into 17, what you can see here is that for the first one, you kind of immediately knew, in both cases, you kind of immediately knew it was a multiplication problem. And for the first one, you probably knew you could solve it very easily. For the second one, probably a precise solution did not come to mind, and you probably felt that you would choose or not choose to engage in this. And this is where you're experiencing slow thinking as you proceed through a sequence of steps. So what this means is that it's a process of mental work. So you have to be deliberate, effortful, and orderly. And that's kind of what slow thinking is. And it's like your muscles tense up, you have your blood pressure rose, your heart rate increased. So that's kind of what's happening because you're thinking about a problem a little bit more. For example, you take this other example. So here, if I ask everyone, how did you decide to brush your teeth this morning? It's probably people didn't really think about it as much, and it probably just automatically happen because it's something that you do every day. Now, if you think about the second problem, which is how did you decide to apply for the job you're currently in? So if you're in a job right now, how did you go through that? Here, you probably took a lot more effort. It was a lot more mental accounting, a lot more activity. So if you think about both sets, it talks to system 1 and system 2. So the first one is, if you think about how you brushed your teeth this morning, it's fast, automatic, it's built on routine. System 2 is how to decide to apply for this job. It's more slow, it's conscious, it's effort-based. So system 1 operates automatically and quickly with little or no effort and no sense of voluntary control. And some examples of automatic activities attributed to system 1 include like making a disgusted face when you see like a horrible picture, or completing a phrase that's really well known, or turning your head when you want to hear when you hear a loud bang. It just automatically happens. Whereas system 2 allocates attention to the effortful mental activities that demand it, including complex computations. So the highly diverse operations of system 2 have one feature in common. They require attention and they're disrupted when attention is drawn away. And some examples include searching memory to identify if a sound sounds familiar, or looking at someone that you kind of recognize, or this kind of question that I posed, or thinking about more complex systems or problems. So that's the difference between system 1 and system 2. And it's two ways to think about how people make decisions. One is intuitive and instinct-based, and one is more rational thinking. And this just helps us contextualize how people are making decisions every day, and why knowing and understanding these two kinds of systems actually helps us design better interventions and design better solutions as well.
Thank you. So, too many screens up. Okay. So keeping system 1 and system 2 in mind, we're going to do a quick little exercise. And we want to look at behavioral science in your life. So I'd like you to imagine that you're driving home from work, and as you stop at this red light, the white van next to you runs through it. In this scenario, what might you think about the driver in the white van? Feel free to add to the chat. So what do you think about the driver in the white van when you see them run the red light? Maybe kind of careless. Yep, breaking the law. Okay, great, thank you. So frequently when people talk about what's happening with people and they see them run a red light, they're thinking about their individual characteristics. They say things like the driver is rude, they're reckless, they have no patience. And as humans, it's really less often for us to think about the situational factors or what's happening in the context for that driver. Like perhaps the driver might have had someone with a medical emergency in their back seat, or the driver was distracted by a crying child and they just didn't see the light. And so this is something us as humans do very often, something we find in behavioral science, is we focus on the features of the person when we try to see what's wrong, why something happened. And we kind of disregard the features of the context. Yep, like Nishit's saying is maybe they had an emergency. And so doing this it's actually a psychology that we talk about frequently called the fundamental attribution error. And so this is the tendency to attribute another's actions to their character or personality, while attributing one's own behavior to external situations and factors outside of our control. So I bring this up because when you're thinking about behavioral design and you're really trying to look at what is going on, we want to try to overcome our fundamental attribution error and think about not what's wrong with the person, but what might be happening in their context that is causing the behaviors that we're seeing. And so for this, a quick example for implications for program design. In thinking about caretakers who do not start complementary feeding at 6 months with adequate food. There's a lot that goes into this, but thinking about this nutritional problem, what are some features of the person, people might say? Feel free to add to the chat, but for sake of time, I will go through for my answers. So if you want to add features of the person you might think about for this problem, and then I also challenge you more to think about more features for the context. So frequently what people might think initially for features of the person is, oh, people are too stubborn and don't want to learn about new ways of feeding. Or maybe people won't put effort required in to learn about healthier foods. Or people are just helpless. They're unable to do this themselves. So that's really features of the person. But if we looked at the context here, things that we maybe would come up with instead are that nutrition information does not include locally available foods. So people receive the information, but the foods they see, they don't have access to them. Another feature of the content could be other demands pull attention away from what they feed the baby. So they're focusing on many other things, many other concepts. Also seeing in here that they're poor, and poor we also call like there's a lot of scarcity in people's lives. So when people have scarcity, then it's more easy to focus. They tunnel their attention on certain things that are more immediate, and maybe feeding the baby is less immediate. And finally, there might be no cues for when and how to feed the baby. So a woman who is with her 6-month-old, the caretakers, maybe there is no cue in their context to really help them remember to start feeding. And so that's just the implications of fundamental attributional error for design. If you think about the features for the person, you'd come up with one type of design, but really that likely will not work because it's really the features of the context that are driving. Great. And a very quick summary, we could talk about this for a couple hours, but we want to talk about like psychologies are only part of the picture in behavioral design. What's happening in someone's head is good to understand, but really what is important for behavioral design is the context. Context matters. And here are just some quick examples of context. There's a lot more, but people's physical environment in which they're acting and making decisions, the social context around them, the choice set that is offered them, the mood that they're in, well, the time of day, the time of year. Time is a big part of the context. And as we briefly mentioned was chronic scarcity, or I saw people mention poverty in the chat. That really, when people are chronically in a mindset of scarcity, that can have some really long-term effects. While short-term scarcity can help us focus, a chronic scarcity could really limit our cognitive bandwidth. And all of this is to say that the context matters. It's very important. And as behavioral designers, we want to fix the context and not the person. We're trying to change people's environments and not them. And I will hand it back over to Prithika.
And then here's another example. So when we think about context and we think about people's decision-making, it's to also as behavioral designers, what we look to do is to design for that intention action gap. So if you look at this decision-making process, there's a desire that someone has that animals healthy and prosperous, and their intention is that they're going to get vaccinated to protect them, and the action is that I will take care of my animals to the nearest vet, and the outcome is they're safe. But then what actually happens is that a lot of different factors that they don't actually understand what the vaccine is, they don't actually trust it, they don't know where to get it, maybe they don't have enough money, maybe there's misleading information on the perception of a vaccine, maybe there's multiple vaccines, and they're not seeing the point of this. So our intentions don't always match up to our actions because there's a lot of different factors that actually affect it. And I think a thing to keep in mind is that this happens because we spend because we're far more like we talked about before, where we act in more irrational ways than we would like to believe. And that's a lot about what behavioral design looks to solve. So what we're going to go over just really quickly is the approaches that both Ideas 42 and Busara take to approach behavioral design. So when it comes to Busara's process, what does our end-to-end research advisory work look like, or a project at Busara? So there's 5 phases. It starts with align, which is looking to align with clients, make sure that we understand the problem that we're looking to solve. And we go to understand, how are we actually making sense of all this context? What is the problem that we're looking to solve? And how are we getting deeper insights? Then design, which is about designing interventions for for the key insights that we've developed from the understand phase, and then assess, which is like testing out these interventions to see how they actually prove, and then share is like how are we disseminating this information to the wider people. I'll hand it over to Ellie to talk about Idea 42's process.
Thanks. And here is Ideas 42's process. We use different words than Busara, but really I think, as we'll go in our detail, a lot of what we do is similar. So we just call it the define the problem you're working on, diagnose the barriers, design, which we're talking about more today, is how you design to overcome those behavioral barriers. Next, we look at testing, which can be both feasibility, RCT, implementation tests, and in an ideal world, scaling these solutions. But when we do scale, we really keep in mind how important context is, and you can't just kind of drop an intervention into a new context. You need to kind of reassess what works in that context and what doesn't. And here you can see a lot of circles and arrows and things that go back and forth. And really that is just to say behavioral design is iterative. You're constantly going back, you're constantly checking if your assumptions worked and fixing things. So it's not necessarily always linear, but there's moments that you will go backwards in the process.
Yeah, thank you. So the process of applying behavioral design around the world, a general consensus has emerged on the process of applying this this kind of process. While each group and each firm or each organization has its own terminology and emphasis, the core process, I think, is like very similar. They usually apply behavioral design and behavioral science for problem solving ends. Typically, problem solving looks like aligning on behaviors of interest, understanding and diagnosing their causes, designing interventions to increase or decrease them, assessing impact and iterating, and then sharing and scaling of those insights. So I think instead of being more generic, what makes this applied behavioral science process threefold is that it builds upon a specific body or of empirical literature in behavioral science that encompasses the fields of behavioral economics, cognitive psychology, experimental economics, sociology, anthropology, sociology, etc. This literature provides evidence on decision-making and behavioral mechanisms and a framework for thinking about behavior that's contextual, malleable, and social. And this is essential to make sure that we understand and diagnose those causes. It also focuses on changing behavior instead of merely understanding behavior or changing attitudes, beliefs. The discipline only focuses on the extent to which we can actually drive behavior change. And this is a core part of the design and enriches the align stage as well. And then it's committed to revalidating and testing. So behavior change is really hard, and many well-meaning efforts sometimes have no effects and can backfire. Hence, we need to assess and iterate and be thoughtful and conscious in our efforts to share and scale. So that's a little bit about talking about both our processes. So what we're going to do now is we're going to look at each stage and dive deep into it and just give you a little bit of what it includes in the process.
Thanks. So I will quickly touch on our define or Busara's align stage. And so really in the first stage of defining a problem, it's really important to spend time here to make sure you are defining a specific behavior and the audience that you're looking to influence. And this is done with conversations with stakeholders, interviews with your end user, observations. It's really a process that is very collaborative. It's not just the behavioral designer coming in and saying, this is the problem, but it's really thinking about what might the behavioral problem be, and then verifying it exists before moving on to the next stage. So behavioral economics or behavioral design can really address problems in kind of any of these stages, the structural, the social, the interpersonal. But within all of these, it's important to define a problem that's within an actor's control to change. So if you're looking to change something that is more structural, like maybe stock outs of family planning methods, instead of doing intervention with the woman who was looking for the method, she can't control if there's a stock out or not. But someone who's working at the Ministry of Health or working on supply chains, they're maybe making decisions that are impacting if there's a family planning method or not. So in thinking about applying behavioral design, sometimes you think, oh, it can just be individual or interpersonal problems, but no, there are ways to be creative and to think about them in this broader ways, as long as you're identifying the right actor who has the control to that problem. This is a very short version of what we look at when defining a behavioral statement, but main things you need to focus on is making sure specific behavior. A very key thing we see a lot is stating the problem without embedded assumptions. At this moment, you do not want to be guessing why the behavioral problem exists. You just want to be stating the problem. So you don't want to state people don't go to health facilities because they don't know. You don't know if people have the knowledge or not. At this point, you need to do more investigation around that. And then finally, you want to define a problem that's at the right level. It's something that your behavioral design will really be able to impact, and making sure it's not too broad or too narrow.
So once we understand what we want to accomplish, the next question generally is, why is this not already happening? What is stopping the person from taking positive action of interest, or why are they currently taking a negative action? So this is meant to understand. And when we are diagnosing a problem, there's like pathway to current desired outcomes. So think of the best way of tapping into micro behaviors being investigated. So micro behaviors offer insights into small steps that can be considered to understand where the pain points are and where they need to be addressed. So what is the current path versus the ideal path that the person is trying to get to? I'm going to turn my video off just to make sure it's not as choppy. Great. I think asking questions without leading the participants, and then also when possible, choosing a conceptual framework to guide the process of creating an instrument or to use in your understand phase. So you can draw on there's different frameworks, and we'll walk you through 3 just as an example really quickly. And these can help you understand what's actually missing. And there's a lot of different tools that you can use to diagnose the problem. So the first framework that we have is CREATE, which is cue, reaction, evaluation, ability, timing, and experience. So when we think about the CREATE, when we're talking about cue, we're looking at, is there anything that's current? Is there anything currently that your user uses to cue thinking about taking an action in a specific moment? Reaction, what emotional reactions do they have?
It looks like we might have lost Prithika. So I'm going to go on from here.
I'm back.
Oh, you're back. Yay, we can hear you.
Awesome.
You ended at evaluation.
So the first, okay, perfect. Thanks, Ellie. So the first framework that we have is CREATE. So when we think about cues, are there any current cues that your user is thinking about when taking an action or in a specific moment? Then reaction, what emotional reactions do they have in a specific moment? Is it negative or dismissive? Evaluation, what is their evaluation of the costs and benefits? Ability, their ability to act, or do they think they'll succeed? Timing, is it urgent right now, or will they procrastinate? And then experience, have they had a negative experience in the past? So that's your first framework. And you think about it in terms of diagnosing a problem, and you identify specific micro behaviors that are probably problems that they're lacking, are problems or what they're lacking in order for them to evaluate the cognitive and behavioral obstacles that happen. Then the second framework that we have, that's also most commonly used, is the COM-B, which is which is a behavior change framework that's widely used amongst a lot of different people and people in the industry. And it's used to assess how you can actually make a positive behavior change happen and which interventions can be effective. And it focuses on 3 specific components, which is capabilities, which refers to a person's physical or psychological ability to perform a behavior. Opportunities, which looks at referring to anything that's physical or social environment that may encourage or discourage a behavior. And then motivations refers to internal reflective and automatic mechanisms that activate or inhibit a behavior. So Ellie, it's the next slide. Great. So this is your typical COMBI framework that people use, and this is what it looks like. So it's capability, opportunity, and motivation. And then the third one that we have is behavior mapping, and it's similar to journey mapping. So here you're looking at mapping barriers and levers across a specific journey. And a good thing to keep in mind is like breaking it down to these 4 different aspects. So structural barriers, that Ellie mentioned before, is like external frictional points that arise how decision-making environment is structured. Psychological barriers, which is internal cognitive processes that may decrease a customer's likelihood to perform a target behavior. Then you have levers. What do we do about this specific situation and how can it actually help? Like, what is the positive? And then intervention opportunities. So for each specific micro behavior, there's structural and psychological barriers. So you want to think about what's, if you're looking at a spreadsheet that you want to add, which is structural and which is actually a behavioral barrier. And then where there's also barriers, there's also levers. So things that your customers or users might have said in your research that is positive that you can use to actually help design a good intervention, or you can leverage within your intervention. That's what you consider here. And then later on, you have intervention opportunities, which will come through your design phase. So you'll add this on as a layer in your design phase. So, how do you have these frameworks. So how do you actually use different methods? So here's an example of like a lot of different methods that you can use to sort of help you understand and diagnose a problem. And it gives you a detail about the use case and the benefits and outputs. I'm not going to go into detail about this, but I just want to give an overview of what this could look like. And we could talk about an hour about each of these different methods, but these actually help you think about the methods that you can use to diagnose your problems.
Thanks. And so now we'll move on to the next stage, which in both of our frameworks we call design, which is helpful. And so when we think of design and the process after doing the first 2 steps, we're really thinking about these kind of 3 more micro steps within it. So first you want to start with ideation. And this is really creating ideas for solutions. And this will come from the problem statement that you initially developed, and you'll be looking at the barriers you identified during diagnosis. From after ideation, where you go wide and you want to think of as many ideas as possible, you then start to narrow them down and decide on just a few of those ideas that you will bring into prototypes. Sorry, this was in French before, so it says prototipos, but this is prototypes. And that's creating a draft of possible solutions. And during this, you really are going to do it iteratively. You're going to go back and you're going to fix your prototypes, and they won't be fixed. They're kind of drafts that you can use for user testing, where you will test possible solutions. And we recommend always doing this, and we'll talk a little more in depth about all 3 of these. Maybe a little more quickly since we're already at 10:40 East Coast time. So ideation, again, it's creating many ideas. You want to go broad before you start going narrow. So don't judge your ideas, don't cut your ideas, go with as many as you can at this moment in time. And there's a lot of different kind of prompts and ways to do ideation, and maybe there's some content we can share with you after this. We won't get into it today. And so one big question we ask is, what does good design look like? Should it be done by an individual or by a group? And usually in person, I'd ask this question and get people to respond. And mostly people think it's about groups. But that's not wrong, but we don't want people to start with group ideation and group design. We want people to spend time individually first, really thinking about design ideas. So when you do an individual ideation before group ideation, you will generate more ideas, and these ideas will be more original. And this happens because when people get into groups, there's a couple of things that happen. There could be social loafing, where people don't want to actually participate because they assume others know more or will do better. There's a fear in groups of judgment. So people will not say their ideas because they think they'll be judged by others. And then there's also it's hard to pay attention to others sharing your ideas and come up with your own ideas. So when you're in a group, you're listening and you don't have time to think. So just here we want to remind people to do individual ideation before any kind of group ideation or design. And that includes asking both your design team, your stakeholders, and your end users to get involved in this whole process. So basically, the main thing for ideation is defer judgment. At this moment, you want to come up with any ideas. The more out of the box can be, the better. There will be some key nuggets in there that will help you with design. Go a little quicker because of time. So after you have your ideation, you go broad, you narrow in on just a few of the ideas that you'll create prototypes of. And a prototype is a draft of a possible solution that really captures the intention of your design idea and helps you simulate it so you can show other people. Prototypes allow you to share your idea with others, gather the feedback from them, and learn how to further refine it. And you can really prototype just about anything. It can be a process, it can be a tool, it can be just kind of like a new space. There's many ways to prototype. So just a quick pictures of what a prototype is. They're made of like cardboard. They're less refined. You don't want people to think that it's a final design because you want them to give you honest feedback on ways to change. And you also want to give them different options to choose between. So prototypes progress from rough drafts to more refined outputs. This is an example of a family planning tool that we created. I'll just show you how it started. It started with a rough sketch. We had some ideas of what we could do. We then maybe added some more detail using the computer. Then we created a physical version of it that we could put in front of people. And ultimately, there was a lot more iterations between this, but ultimately a counseling poster was designed. And so, like I said, you can prototype anything. I'm just going to put this up quickly so we can move on. But products, services, activities, communications or messages, and physical spaces. And you can use anything to prototype. Get creative here, use any materials you have access to, and make sure you go ahead and make it something you can put in front of someone else that looks like a rough draft instead of a refined process. Up to you, Prithika.
Thanks, Ellie. Then when we think about all of the different components and interventions that we've designed, what we're trying to do is assess and validate if these interventions actually work and what it actually looks like in the field from our users. So this is what the assess component of both Ideas 42 and Busara's look like. There's different approaches to assessment. And that could be IDIs, which is qualitative or quantitative, so in-depth interviews to help understand the context or a problem in a new way. So you could think about how, if a prototype actually works, like what does that actually look like? You could do FGDs to understand group dynamics about a specific prototype, how it's actually performing, how people are forming consensus when it comes to a specific prototype. And then you have quantitative testing, which is like RCTs or lab games. And there's surveys and there's a lot more, but a key difference and a key thing to keep in mind about when you're assessing and testing is qualitative approaches are more likely to be in earlier stages of the prototype building process to tease out more nuances in relation to ideating on prototype imagery and messaging. When it comes to quantitative approaches, it's more likely to be used in the final stages and where you want to get consensus with a larger group. So you're looking to elicit more individual preferences across users and more thinking about more statistical representativeness of a sample as well. So that is something to keep in mind. But for the sake of this, I'm going to just dive a little bit into qualitative and user testing. So you have an understanding of how we actually test potential prototypes. So what is user testing? It actually allows us to try out prototypes of your intervention. It can be to test aspects of it or just certain aspects. And what you want to do is you want to improve the prototype based on the feedback of the user. So when you're going into a larger quantitative test, you're more confident with the kind of prototypes and interventions you're putting forward. So what does it look like? So what is user testing? It's letting people experience your prototype as you envision it and how they respond to it. And this is kind of like an example of what they look like. And as Ellie showed us, it's like early mock-ups of your prototype, and it allows people to sort of work together, play with it, comment on the imagery, letting them almost co-design what that looks like with you. And then why do you run a user test? It's to strengthen your prototype. So it's to build upon and refine it with your users. It's to check if any elements of your behavior intentions work as planned with no unintended consequences or misunderstanding, to tease out the use and demand of an intervention, and to eliminate any significant issues. So to actually ensure that what the user actually wants, you're giving it to them, and without spending a lot of money doing it. And then tips to get most out of your user testing. Quick iterations is important. It's good to test early and build and go up in fidelity of your prototypes, so you're able to know what your users actually want. And it's also good to remove prototypes that don't actually work, and to get that out.
Okay, it seems we lost Prithika one more time, but we will share these out. And so maybe showing people a couple versions of your prototypes for user testing is also a good practice, because people have an easier time giving feedback then. We did have case studies that we wanted to share, but this was too much content, and we apologize, and we can have a follow-on webinar about behavioral design. But one activity we did have, but we'll just go right to questions now, is this design activity we'll share with everybody. This is really a warm-up where you can use this to get your creative juices flowing when you're going into ideation, when you're going into a design session. It's something you can do. So we'll share the slides, and maybe you can do this on your own. And I really recommend you write down your 2 words before moving on to the next slide. So we'll just skip this, but we will go right into the Q&A. And I was answering via chat one question, so maybe I'll get it started there. And if Prithika comes back on, she can help add to this. Someone asked about ethical, if you need to get ethical review. I think Sonali, ethical approaches required for these assessments. And so in the design stage, like the user testing and the prototype testing, that's really looking at improvements to processes and to programs. So for that moment, we don't get ethical approval, but this is really something with the organization you should discuss. And this is just in the design phase. Sometimes during the diagnosis phase, depending on who our end users are, who we're speaking with to identify behavioral barriers, we do go through a local IRB process. Because those are more in-depth qualitative interviews. But for all of this, I want to remind people that we're not studying the people and the behaviors, we're really understanding the context so we can do design. So the reason for the study is to improve processes and products. So less often do we go through a full IRB, but it's conversations we constantly have with our partners who are in the field and our implementing partners. And so I don't know if there's any other questions.
I think maybe just to add to that, Ellie, I would say that usually I think even if your project doesn't need IRB, I think the way you work with people should always be ethical, and then thinking about considerations and where they're coming from. So thinking about the way you're phrasing questions. This is why people do pilots even before you go into running an FGD or IDI. So all of those things, just considering who your people are and how you're thinking about what tools you're using to work with them.
Thanks, Prithika. We had one question from earlier from Miriam, and I don't think that we addressed it yet in the chat, but a specific question about unconscious bias training, and if that might help be able to better understand contextual design decisions.
So I'm not familiar with that bias training. I don't know, Prithika, if you are.
Yeah, I think I don't know. I'm not familiar either, but I think what I'm understanding is the question is that how do you design when people have unconscious biases in mind? I think I think just to if that's what my understanding is, I think one thing to do is that I think in your align and diagnose phase, a lot of it is understanding these people's key drives. So you're understanding what actual factors actually affect the decision making. So you're designing for kind of those biases, like people are affected by their peers, people are affected because they had a really negative memory about something, and that's actually going to affect how they look at a product. And with insurance, for example, like that's a lot of insurance product, right? Like people have very negative experiences with customer service, or with the way just insurance is, or like what they've heard about it. And that's like something you need to work towards in your intervention design to mitigate or overcome. So you typically in your define and diagnosis, it should help you uncover a lot of these different biases and help contextualize what's actually happening.
Thanks, Prithika. A question from Chris. Any tips on implementing this process in partner nations?
What do you mean by partner nations? I'm not familiar. I guess that would be a clarification. I don't know, Ellie, do you have?
Oh, okay. So specifically using different languages and cultures. So in contexts and situations where you might be speaking a different language or from a different culture.
I'm happy to chip in, and then Ellie, I'd love to ask, go ahead as well. So Busara specifically works in the global south. So all of our work that we do is mostly sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, Latin America. So we work in a lot of contexts that people don't actually speak English, and in a lot of different cultures. And a key thing we do is like we work with either partners or we hire local people who know the dialect and understand that. And what we do is like we do a lot of trainings with them if they're going out to the field asking questions or helping us design or prototype things. They have a good understanding of the problem, but we're designing instruments, keeping in mind all these different cultural contexts in order to actually serve them better. So that's what in your align or define phase, you're looking at like where are we working? What is the context, right? And what do we need to consider? What kind of questions is taboo to ask? How do we be mindful about asking these? And then when you go into diagnosis, you're working with people who understand local dialects, making sure that they're speaking to the communities directly, so they're more open, or you're trying different techniques, like we mentioned before, to keep those cultural considerations in mind.
Yes, I just want to echo that. I think working with local stakeholders and people in the communities where you actually are designing for is something that helps this. There are extra resources needed when you need translators and other people, but I think something that we center is our implementing partners that we work with, because we don't implement any of the designs that we work with Ideas 42, but we work with like local organizations that are there and really tap into their resources a lot. And I'm sharing in the chat, if someone asks questions about designing for campaigns, I don't think we can like get into that, but I'm sharing a checklist that kind of talks about some behavioral design around communications if people want to check that out with one of our partners called B-Hub. But go ahead, Tyler.
No, thank you. And we will be sure to include that with the recording and with the slides as well. So for the recording, we're sharing a resource that will help folks think through applying behavioral design and behavioral economics to campaign design. Any other thoughts on that from Prithika?
No, I think that's a really that's great. Thanks, Ellie, for sharing that. I think another thing just to add, if you think about communication design, if you do early prototype testing through like understanding images or messaging, that's a good way to to apply behavioral science and behavioral design. And a key thing that we do is if you know someone is affected by peers, you kind of want to think about how using peers in your imagery or messaging, and that could be part of your communication campaign.
Great. Some great insights from Nishit, as well as a request for any additional books or other references. So we'll be sure to get those from you, Prithika and Ellie, to share. And perhaps as our final question for today from Etienne, would love to hear your thoughts on using behavioral design to redesign more structural barriers that can go beyond individual level behavioral barriers.
Yeah, I think, I know Ellie needs to head out. Ellie, thanks, Ellie.
Ellie.
So Etienne, I think to answer, when you look at, if you say, when you're understanding and diagnosing a problem, I think it's good to differentiate between structural and behavioral problems. I think oftentimes structural problems, you cannot solve using behavior change. What you can do is advice implementing partners, advise donors on how they can think about structural problems. Like, for example, the example that Ellie had talked about was about stockouts, right? So how can we add more of a specific contraceptive so stockouts don't happen, because that's not on the end user, so you can't really do much. Or if infrastructure isn't being set up, then there's not a lot of control you can have in terms of like changing someone's behavior because of the context in which they live in. So I think keeping in mind that thinking about which problems actually behavior and which problems are structures is a key part of your define phase to understand what you can actually solve. Because oftentimes people think that almost every problem could be done by behavior change, and that's not always the case. But it can help you identify which is structural and which is behavioral.
Great. Well, thank you, Prithika. And thank you, a huge thank you for all of the work that this took, that you and Ellie put into the presentations. I think we have, it was a huge success. People were very interested and looks like are very excited to get the presentations and the recording. So we will be sending those out shortly. But just a big thank you for everyone for joining. And again, to Ellie and to Prithika. Otherwise, we will see you all for future Springboard webinars, and have a great rest of your day. All right. Thanks,
everyone.
Bye.